Hello and welcome. There were a lot of great suggestions on the previous Quick Reviews video. There were so many that I felt compelled to sit down and do another video about recent material. So if you want more reviews like this, leave a like, a comment, or subscribe. Or join my Patreon, where you get early access to these reviews. Okay, no more self-promotional preamble. Let's get to the good stuff. Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees. Written and illustrated by Patrick Horvath. Published by IDW. The series is described as Dexter meets Richard Scarry, which is a perfectly good description. The text and plot gives off a Dexter vibe, while the artwork clearly looks like a children's book. The story opens on a bright and pleasant small town called Woodbrook. The protagonist, Samantha Strong, walks to work, greeting the citizens and highlighting how lovely and peaceful life is like in this community. It's a pitch-perfect setup, with one really nice piece of foreshadowing. The story then takes a dark turn. Samantha makes her way to the big city where she intends to, as she calls it, play. Here she finds someone random to murder before ritualistically cutting them up and burying those parts in cans of white paint. The next day, there is a parade celebrating Woodbrook's bicentennial. Unfortunately, on the centerpiece float, a citizen has been crucified and put on display. What works is Samantha's motivation to find the killer in Woodbrook. It's completely self-serving, as she doesn't want an investigation to inadvertently stumble upon her murderous activities. She doesn't care about the peace and well-being of her community. She only cares about assuring she remains undetected. It's a very sociopathic reaction. Beneath the Trees has a pretty classic theme, which is looking at the darkness that underlies the artifice of any community. In this case, it's the simplistic lifestyle of a close-knit town where everyone knows each other and their business. On the surface, everything looks shiny and happy, but just below, there are dark secrets hiding from the light. In one interesting scene, Samantha sees a bear that has witnessed her burying a body. She politely asks if this matter could be kept between the two of them. The bear responds by walking away, which I believe can be interpreted a few ways. Samantha is the civilized persona. The bear is her animus, or her primal instinct to murder. With that instinct satiated, the bear needs nothing further. Or possibly, Samantha is the conscious self, trying to rationalize with her subconscious needs, as personified by the bear. It's a simple exchange, but it evokes a fair amount of interpretation. Perhaps the only aspect that feels quite unoriginal is the Dexter angle, which is a serial killer hunting down another killer for selfish reasons. Arguably, both are extreme anti-heroes with self-serving goals. It's not done poorly, but it's hard not to notice the similarities. Overall, the juxtaposition of the cute town and its residents dealing with a few brutal murders creates a tone that is very well managed. It could have easily been ridiculous and absurd, like say, The Unfunnies. But like Blacksad, Beneath the Trees feels oddly grounded, even though its adorable animals being rather terrible. At the time of this writing, 4 issues are out, and it appears to be a 6-issue series. Hopefully it has an ending that is reasonable, and doesn't try to throw in some major mind-blowing twist. For example, Samantha has developed a split personality, and the killer she's looking for is herself. Admittedly, it doesn't appear to be headed in that direction, but I would reevaluate my opinion if it did. Faceless and the Family, written and illustrated by Matt Lesniewski, published by Oni Press. First of all, this is highly recommended for anyone who likes Copra. The artwork has the same high-energy, outsider art feel to it. To me, the art style was very reminiscent of some of the more abstract underground artists. And notably, Lesniewski is one of the few artists I can think of that designs sound effects and integrates them into his artwork. For those that read digitally, if you have a decent monitor, I would suggest reading it on your computer. The pages look astounding when viewed at a larger size. Each panel contains a lot of details, which I think makes the artwork look too busy when viewed at a smaller size. Personally, I found it visually confusing at times when reading it on my iPad, but those scenes popped at a larger size. The plot is reasonably straightforward. Faceless escapes his life of crime and wants to go to another city to change his face so he can reconnect with his family. During his journey, he is joined by others who support his need for a superficial change, despite their reservations. Beyond that, it's best not to get into other revelations or how the series ends. Overall, it's thematically about family and about the weight of the past. One character literally carries that weight around with him, while everyone else has their past trailing behind them. It always seems close by and never out of view. Naturally, the message is, you can't escape your past, no matter what steps you take to avoid it. The family that develops is one of choice, not of blood, which seems to be a modern take on the concept of a family. The other difference is that no one fulfills a specific role, such as mother or father. Everyone has the same level of authority within the family. It's not flaunting or mocking traditionalism, but it is offering an alternate possibility when one considers what a family might be. The entire series reads like a structured fever dream. The setting itself is equally bizarre. It takes place on a giant rocky hand, which sprouts warts that spew demonic creatures at random intervals. Sure, it's a convenient way to provide conflict and move the plot forward, but it does feel organic, in the sense that it feels like an environment where something like that might occur. It's a series worth at least a look for the artwork alone. Local Man, written by Tim Seeley, illustrated by Tony Fleeks, published by Image Comics. Local Man is a homage to the wild, action-oriented days of early Image Comics. It's also about the aftereffects of those melodramatic times. I should point out, I'm not overly familiar with a lot of second-wave Image material, nor do I feel any sense of nostalgia for those times. So there's likely a lot of Easter eggs I missed that others will get. And the appeal of revisiting the glory days of Image is completely lost on me. The story is centered around Jack Xaver, also known as Crossjack, a disgraced hero who returns to his hometown to figure out his life. He's legally prevented from using his powers or engaging in any superhero activity. Also, due to the high profile of his former team and the circumstances of his dismissal, Jack is hated by just about everyone he meets. When a former villain from his hometown is murdered, Jack is the prime suspect. From there, the story revolves around exploring Jack's past while he tries to uncover who committed the murder. To begin with, one doesn't have to be familiar with the Image library to get into Local Man. The series is definitely playing into someone's nostalgia for those early Wild West days, but the story is not dependent on foreknowledge of Image circa 1994 to 1998. It's probably nice to have, but as established, that's not in my memory banks. Yet I found the story easy to follow, and I got the gist of the nostalgia it was trying to evoke. Structurally, it owes a lot to Alan Moore's Supreme run. The past portions fill in the gaps of the present story and give it the missing context one needs. Not to mention, the past parts evoke that 90s high drama and action feeling, while the modern parts are far more grounded and somber. Certainly, Moore didn't invent this device, but it wouldn't be surprising if Seeley took inspiration from Moore's usage. One thing that stood out is it references some Image properties directly, but the team the lead character was once part of, which was clearly supposed to be Gen 13, is renamed to 3rd Gen. Out of curiosity, I looked up Gen 13 and noted it was a Homage Studios title, owned by Jim Lee, which he sold to DC in 1999. So Gen 13 was off the table as source material. I presume there are a lot of disguised parallels to Gen 13 characters, but again, if there are, they're completely lost on me. To be clear, I'm not saying this is bad. In fact, it's rather good and quite enjoyable. But it's hard not to notice it's squarely aiming for those that loved the early days of Image. Yet it also appeals to anyone, like myself, who found those comics to be unreadable trash. Sure, it's influenced by a lot of material that preceded it, but so are a lot of classic, well-written comics, like the aforementioned Supreme series by Moore. So far, it's a decent read and accessible to basically everyone. In contrast to Local Man, there's Radiant Black, written by Kyle Higgins and Cherish Chen, primarily illustrated by Marcello Costa, published by Image Comics. The basic setup is almost identical to Local Man. A man in his 20s returns home to live with his parents after being a failure at being an adult. He randomly discovers an item that turns him into a superhero. Cutting to the chase, this series is Power Rangers fanfiction, with every cliché about life as a millennial firmly in place. To be blunt, where Local Man succeeds, Radiant Black fails. It may appeal to those who loved the Power Rangers when they were young, because otherwise, it is some pretty terrible writing. Bloodrik, written and illustrated by Andrew Crank, published by Image Comics. Bloodrik is about exactly one thing: finding something to eat. Even the backup stories are centered around Bloodrik having a bite to eat. In a way, it's like Conan the Barbarian, mixed with a slight dash of Gru the Wanderer. It's definitely not as lore-heavy as another recent Barbarian series, Headlopper. According to the introduction, this was a series that was 10 years in the making. As I see it, Bloodrik is an example of my advice to any creator. sit down and do the damn work, which is exactly what Crank did, eventually. The artwork is pretty awesome. It has a slight woodcut feel to it, although it would have looked so much better if it was actually inked. Mind you, that may be my own thing. Artwork that's been scanned and then inked by boosting the contrast in Photoshop always stands out as unfinished to me. Visually, it's a style I've never found appealing. In this case, it does work and suits the material, but I can't deny I was also thinking the art would have looked superior with actual inks applied to it. Honestly, there's not a lot to say about this series other than it's a solid read. It's pretty great for a lazy Sunday afternoon. Blue Book, 1961. Written by James Tynion, illustrated by Michael Avon Oeming, published by Dark Horse. Personally, I'm quite interested in the UFO phenomenon. It's something I devoured as a younger, developing mind. I've read or watched any and all alien-related stuff produced before, roughly, 1994. Then the X-Files became a big thing, and there was an explosion of UFO material, which produced an even bigger explosion of questionable, air quotes, evidence. Regardless, even to this day, despite UFOs being relabeled as UAPs for no good reason, it's something I still have a keen interest in, although my lens is definitely objective and skeptical in nature. The point being, when it comes to the UFO phenomenon, I am well versed. Blue Book 1961 is exclusively about Barney and Betty Hill, who are the subjects of the first documented alien abduction case. They weren't the first to encounter aliens, but they were the first to be kidnapped, experimented on, and have their memory altered, allegedly. Their story also popularized the insect-like appearance of what is commonly known as the Greys. Their story is told in a moderately clinical style, giving it the appearance that it maintains a degree of objectivity, but is definitely sympathetic towards the experience the Hills reported and is skewed in favor of accepting their story at face value. It doesn't judge or evaluate their story. It simply relates what happened, according to the Hills. What's important to note is the fundamental shift in the perception of aliens. Until that point, they were seen as benevolent space brethren who wanted to help our species. They were especially concerned about atomic weapons. After the Hills' experience, the mythology shifted. Aliens became a dark presence that abducted humans to perform experiments on them. They operated in secret and did unspeakable things to their subjects. Historically speaking, the Hill story is quite important to UFO lore. The only area the series glosses over is how Betty developed into an unreliable narrator after that experience, and perhaps how she was used by various individuals who had an agenda to capitalize on her notoriety. It's an unsavory element, but it's certainly part of the overall story, so it's a touch misleading to leave it out of the narrative. Then again, that would lead to skeptical criticism regarding the story, and that's something the series avoids almost entirely. I should mention there's another limited series, Blue Book 1947, that's currently being published. The miniseries looks at the very early beginnings of the UFO craze and how it firmly placed aliens in popular culture. It's a time when misinformation and disinformation began to be seeded through the narrative. A lot of people, such as the main focus of this series, Kenneth Arnold, were subject to bad actors with questionable agendas. Although, like the previous series, it maintained a clinical but sympathetic view of Arnold's attempt to investigate his encounter and the evidence put forth by others. Overall, despite the one-sided nature of the narrative, both Blue Book series are compelling reads, even though both have a slight Wikipedia feel to them. Still, they are concise and hit all the major beats with a certain level of respect for the people involved. That seems like a good place to stop. But I would like to ask, what are you reading? What new titles have grabbed your attention? Let me know in the comments. With that said, thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Extra special thanks to John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Phil Sagan, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, Steve White, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.